Welcome to Dragon Gray's Variety Show. This episode, we go back to some stories that we had started out last year, or particularly this year. So now that the holidays are pretty much over, and by the way, Happy New Year to everyone. Hope this new year is going to be to your liking. We're going to go back to some of the stories that we started out with. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the stories. We continue Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, Chapter 13. Rodney, who had a driver's license, had made an arrangement to borrow a car for the day from the farm workers at Metchley, a couple of miles down the road. He'd regularly got cars this way in the past, but this particular time the arrangement broke down the day before we were due to set off. Though things got sorted out fairly easily, Rodney walked over to the farm and got a promise on another car. The interesting thing was the way Ruth responded during those few hours when it looked like the trip might have to be called off. Until then, she'd been making out the whole thing was a bit of a joke, that if anything, she was going along with it to please Chrissy. And she'd talked a lot about how we weren't exploring our freedom nearly enough since leaving Helsham. How, anyway, she'd always wanted to go to Norfolk to find all of our lost things. In other words, she'd gone out of her way to let us know she wasn't very serious about the prospect of finding her possible, quote-unquote. That day before we went, I remember Ruth and I had been out for a stroll, and we came into the farmhouse kitchen where Fiona and a few veterans were making a huge stew, and it was Fiona herself, not looking up from what she was doing, who told us how the farm boy had come in earlier with this message. Ruth was standing just in front of me, so I couldn't see her face, but her whole posture froze up. Then, without a word, she turned and pushed past me out of the cottage. I got a glimpse of her face then, and that's when I realized how upset she was. Fiona started to say something like, "Oh, I didn't know." But I said quickly, "That's not what Ruth's upset about. It's about something else, something that happened earlier on. It wasn't very good, but it was the best I could do on the spur of the moment." In the end, as I said, the vehicle crisis got resolved, and early the next morning, in the pitch dark, the five of us got inside and lashed but perfectly decent Rover car. The way we sat was that Chrissy was up front next to Rodney, and the three of us in the back. That was what had felt natural, and we'd got in like without thinking about it. But after only a few minutes, once Rodney had brought us out of the dark, winding lanes onto the proper roads, Ruth, who was in the middle, leaned forward, put her hands on the front seats, and began talking to the two veterans. She did this in a way that meant Tommy and I on the either side of her, couldn't hear anything they were saying. And because she was between us, couldn't talk to or even see each other. Sometimes, on the rare occasion she did lean back, I tried to get something going between the three of us, but Ruth wouldn't pick up on it. And before long, she'd be crouched forwards again, her face stuck between the two front seats. After about an hour with the day starting to break, we stopped to stretch our legs and let Rodney go for a pee. We'd pulled over beside a big empty field, so we jumped over the ditch and spent a few minutes rubbing our hands together and watching our breaths rise. At one point, I noticed Ruth had drifted away from the rest of us and was gazing across the field at the sunrise, so I went over to her and made the suggestion that since she only wanted to talk to the veterans, she swapped seats with me. That way she could go on talking at least with Chrissy and Tommy, and I could have some sort of conversation to while away the journey. I had hardly finished before Ruth said in a whisper, Why do you have to be difficult? Now, all times. I don't get it. Why do you want to make trouble? Then she yanked me around so both our backs were to the others and they wouldn't see if we started to argue. It was the way she did this, rather than her words, that suddenly made me see things her way. I could see that Ruth was making a big effort to present not just herself, but all of us in the right way to Chrissy and Rodney. And here I was threatening to undermine her and start an embarrassing scene. I saw all of this, and so I touched her on the shoulder and went off back to the others. And when we returned to the car, I made sure the three of us sat exactly as before. But now, as we drove on, Ruth stayed more or less silent, sitting right back in her seat. And even when Chrissy or Rodney shouted things to us from the front, responded only in a sulky monosyllables. Things cheered up considerably, though. Once we arrived in our seaside town, we got there around lunchtime and left the rover in a car park beside a mini golf course full of fluttering flags. Oh, I should say fluttering flags. It had turned into a crisp sunny day, and my memory of it was that for the first hour, we all felt so exhilarated to be out and about, we didn't give much thought to what had brought us there. At one point, Rodney actually let out a few whoops, waving his arms around as he led the way up a road, climbing steadily past rows of houses and the occasional shop. And you could sense just from the huge sky that you were walking towards the sea. Actually, when we did reach the sea, we found we were standing on a road carved in the cliff's edge. It seemed at first there was a sheer drop down to the sands, but once you leant over the rail, you could see zigzagging footpaths leading you down the cliff's face to the sea front. We were starving by now and went into a little cafe perched on the cliff just where one of the footpaths began. When we went in, the only people inside were the two chubby women in aprons who worked there. They were smoking cigarettes at one of the tables, but they quickly got up and disappeared into the kitchen, so then we had the place to ourselves. We took the table right at the back, which meant the one stuck out closest to the cliff's edge, and when we sat down, it felt like we were virtually suspended over the sea. I didn't even have anything to compare it with at the time, but I realized now the cafe was tiny with just 3 or 4 little tables. They'd left a window open, probably to stop the place filling with frying smells, so that every now and then a gust would pass through the room, making all the signs advertising their good deals flutter about. There was one cardboard notice pinned over the counter that had been done in colored felt tips, and at the top of it was the word "look" with a staring eye drawn inside each. Oh, I see the same thing so often these days. I don't even register it. But back then, I hadn't seen it before. So I was looking at it admiringly, then caught Ruth's eye and realized she too was looking at it, amazed, and we both burst out laughing. That was a cozy little moment when it felt like we'd left behind the bad feeling that had grown between us in the car. As it turned out, though, it was just about the last moment like that between me and Ruth for the rest of the outing. We hadn't mentioned the possible at all since arriving in the town, and I had assumed when we sat down we'd finally discuss the matter properly. But once we started on our sandwiches, Rodney began talking about their old friend Martin, who'd left the cottages the year before and was now living somewhere in the town. Chrissy eagerly took up the subject, and soon both veterans were coming out of the anecdotes about all the hilarious things Martin had got up to. We couldn't follow much of it, but Chrissy and Rodney were really enjoying themselves. They kept exchanging glances and laughing, and although they pretended it was for our benefit, it was clear they were remembering for each other. Thinking about it now, it occurs to me that the near taboo at the cottages surrounding people who'd left might well have stopped them talking about their friend, even to each other, and it was only once we'd come away they'd felt able to indulge themselves in this way. Whenever they laughed, I laughed too, just to be polite. Tommy seemed to be understanding things even less than me and was letting out heart little half laughs that lagged some way behind. Ruth, though, was laughing and kept nodding to everything being said about Martin, just like she, too, was remembering them. Then once, when Chrissy made a really obscure reference, she'd said something like, "Oh, yes, the time he put out his jeans." Ruth gave a big laugh and signaled in our direction as though to say to Chrissy, "Go on, explain it to them so they can enjoy it, too." I let this all go, but when Chrissy and Rodney started discussing whether we should go round to Martin's flat, I finally said, maybe a bit coldly, "What exactly is he doing here? Why does he have a flat?" There was a silence. Then I heard Ruth let out an exasperating sigh. Chrissy leaned over to the table towards me and said quietly, like she was explaining to a child, "He's being carer. What else do you think he'd be doing here? He's a proper carer now." There was a bit of shifting, and I said, "That's what I mean. We can't just go and visit him." Chrissy sighed. "Okay, we're not supposed to visit carers? Absolutely, strictly speaking, certainly not encouraged." Chrissy sighed. "Okay, we're not? Okay." Rodney chuckled and added, "Definitely not encouraged. Naughty, naughty to go and visit him." "Very naughty," Chrissy said and made a tooting noise. Then Ruth joined in saying, "Kathy hates to be naughty, so we'd better not go and visit him." Tommy was looking at Ruth, clearly puzzled about whose side she'd taken, and I wasn't sure either. It occurred to me she didn't want the expedition sidetracked and was reluctantly siding with me, so I smiled at her, but she didn't return my look. Then Tommy asked suddenly, "Whereabouts was it you saw Ruth's possible Rodney, ? Or quote unquote." "Oh, Rodney didn't seem nearly so interested in the possible now we were in the town, and I could see anxiety cross Ruth's face. Finally, Rodney said it was a turning off the high street, somewhere off up the other end. Of course, it might be her day off." Then, when no one said anything, he added, "They do have days off, you know. They're not always at their work." For a moment, as he said this, the fear passed through me that we'd misjudged things badly, that for all we knew, veterans often used to talk of possibles just as a pretext to go on trips and didn't really expect to take it any further. Ruth might well have been thinking along the same lines because she was now looking definitely worried, but in the end, she did a little laugh like Rodney had made a joke. Then Chrissy said in a new voice, "You know, Ruth, we might be coming here in a few years. Time to visit you, working in a nice office. I don't see how anyone could stop us visiting you then." "That's right," Ruth said quickly. "You can all come and see me." "I suppose," Rodney said, "there aren't any rules about visiting people if they're working in an office." He laughed suddenly. "We don't know. It hasn't really happened with us before." "It'll be all right," Ruth said. "They let you do it. You can all come and visit me, except Tommy, that is." Tommy looked shocked. "Why can't I come?" "Because you'll already be with me, stupid," Ruth said. "I'm keeping you." We all laughed, Tommy again a little behind the rest of us. "I heard about this girl up in Wales," Chrissy said. "She was Hailsham maybe a few years before you lot. Apparently she was working in the clothes shop right now, a really smart one." There were murmurs of approval, and for a while we all looked dreamily at the clouds. "That's Hailsham for you," Rodney said eventually, and shook his head as though in amazement. And then there was that other person, Chrissy, had turned to Ruth, that boy you were telling us about the other day, the one a couple of years above you, who's a park keeper now. Ruth was nodding thoughtfully. It occurred to me that I should shoot Tommy a warning glance, but by the time I turned to him, he'd already started to speak. "Who was that?" he asked in a bewildered voice. "You know who it is, Tommy," I said quickly. It was too risky to kick him or even make my voice wink wink. Chrissy would have picked it up in a flash, so I said in a dead straight with a bit of weirdness, like we were all fed up with Tommy forgetting all the time. But this just meant Tommy still didn't twig. "Someone we knew?" "Tommy, let's not go through this again," I said. "You'll have to have your brains tested." At last, the penny seemed to drop, and Tommy shut up. Chrissy said, "I know how lucky I am getting to be at the cottages, but you Hailsham lot, you're really lucky, you know." She lowered her voice and leaned forward again. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you a lot about. It's just that back there at the cottages, it's impossible. Everyone's always listening in." She looked around the table, then fixed her gaze on Ruth. Rodney suddenly tensed, and he too leaned forward. And something told me we were coming to what was for Chrissy and Rodney the central purpose of this whole expedition. "When Rodney and I were up in Wales," she said, "the same time we heard about this girl in the clothes shop, we heard something else, something about Hailsham students. What they were saying was that some Hailsham students in the past, in special circumstances, had managed to get a deferral, that this was something you could do if you were a Hailsham student. You could ask for your donations to be put back 3, even 4 years. It wasn't easy, but just sometimes they let you do it, so long as you could convince them, so long as you qualified." Chrissy paused and looked at each of us, maybe for dramatic effect, maybe to check us for signs of recognition. Tommy and I probably had puzzled looks, but Ruth had one on her faces where you couldn't tell what was going on. When they said, Chrissy continued, was that if you were a boy and a girl and you were in love with each other, really, properly in love, and if you could show it, then the people who ran Hailsham, they sorted it out for you. They sorted it out so you could have a few years together before you began your donations. There was now a strange atmosphere around the table, a kind of tingle going round. "When we were in Wales," Chrissy went on, "the students at the White Mansion, they'd heard of this Hailsham couple. The guy had only a few weeks left before he became a carer, and then went to see someone and got everything put back 3 years. They were allowed to go on living there together up at the White Mansion 3 years straight. Didn't have to go on with their training or anything. 3 years just to themselves because they could prove they were properly in love." It was at this point I noticed Ruth nodding with a lot of authority. Chrissy and Rodney noticed too, and for a few seconds they watched her like they were hypnotized. And I had a kind of vision of Chrissy and Rodney back at the cottages. In the months leading up to this moment, probing and prodding this subject between them, I could see them bringing it up at first very tentatively, shrugging, putting it to one side, bringing it up again, never able quite to leave it alone. I could see them toying with the idea of talking to us about it and see them refining how they do it, what exactly they'd say. I looked again at Chrissy and Rodney in front of me, gazing at Ruth, and tried to read their faces. Chrissy looked both afraid and hopeful. Rodney looked on the edge, like he didn't trust himself not to blurt out something he wasn't supposed to. This has been an episode of Never Let Me Go from Draegon Gray's variety show, the Book Club edition. Hope you enjoyed it. Now I'll listen to some music to add to the show, and hope you come back and visit.